What's going on, guys? H3 Music here, and I wanted to begin this video by saying thank you to you all and all your support, especially over the last week. It's been the biggest growth in the last 5 years of my channel, and just wanted to say thank you for all of your guys' support. With that, we're going to be looking at how I created the instrumental remake of NF's The Search. I started recording the video a little bit after I started making the instrumental, but pretty much all I had done up to this point was sample the string part, which was at the end of the beat, and I started placing that throughout the beat. The next thing I did was I realized there was a orchestral snare throughout the beat, so what I did was I pulled that out of a kit I had. It was fairly simple. I added a little bit of overdrive to it to make it a little louder. I also went through and I added a bass to it. I made my own bass in 3x oscillator, and it's pretty simple. It's just a sine wave that's really low, and it has a little bit of decay. I figured out through the SpectroMap in Adobe Auditions that the bass and the entire song was in D minor. As the beat progresses, the pizzicato strings, they get stronger and more get added in, and I had two options. I could have made them in my own plugin, or I could have just copied and pasted the originals but at different octaves. I chose to go with the copy and paste job because that would be simpler and faster. In hindsight, I don't really like how it sounds, but I'm not too sure that my plugin at the time would have been good enough to pull it off. At this point, I skipped over the section before the drop, before he says where'd the beat go, because this had a lot of long drawn out legato strings, and those were just going to be a little bit too complicated at the time. I wanted to get used to the beat a little bit before I went back and did those, so I went directly to the drop part and I started adding in the drums. Tommy Prophet usually during the drop adds in all of the trap drums, so he adds in the kicks, the snares, the hi-hats. Usually in the other portions of his intro type beats it's more orchestral, so it had the orchestral snare earlier, but in this portion it has the actual trap sort of snare and the kick drums. At this portion I also went through, and for every time the kick drum was hit, I re-triggered the bass so the decay of the bass didn't die out over time. One thing I found interesting when I was going through putting in all these drums was that the bass cuts out on every second snare, and what that does is it leaves a little bit of breathing room so that when the bass comes back in, it's stronger. I found that interesting, and that's sort of a pattern he used throughout the entire beat. So I went through and I started adding in impact sounds. The main one I used came from, actually I don't know where it came from. I got it from some stems that Ghost Beats sent over, so shout out to him. I've added a crazy amount of overdrive and distortion to that so it's more powerful. The hi-hats are pretty standard. The only difference compared to a normal 16th note hi-hat is he does have a roll at this point, at the end of the first bar pretty much every time. At this point I realized I was missing a lot of orchestral sounds, so I knew I had to go through and add in more strings, and this meant going through and figuring out what the actual notes of the melody and all were. And I did this by looking at the spectrograph, which showed which pitches were the loudest at the time. Pretty much I was able to look at it and see in general what the pitches were, and then I used a piano to play the melody out to make sure I was using the right pitches. Or sometimes I use a tuner app, and what I do is I just hum the melodies into it, and it tells pretty much what note it is, and so from there I'm able to build out the melodies to the correct pitch. The one problem with using a tuner app is I tend to have the pitch of a yak, so it's pretty rough and doesn't work all the time, but when it does, it works pretty well. So I went through and I added in those extra melodies and all. It just kind of filled out the sound of the orchestra when this drop happens, and that's really the theme with Tommy Prophet instrumentals, is when the big drop happens, there's pretty much a duplication of all the layers at many different octaves. So you're going to have, the note G, and you're going to have it in 4 or 5 different octaves all playing at once, and it just kind of makes everything stronger. I then went through and added in a choir. I had some comments saying they didn't hear the choir, but there is one in there. It's just very quiet compared to everything else. I did the same process for the choirs as I did the cello and violin notes. So I went through and I just hummed it into a tuner, or I did the spectro in order to see what the pitches were. When it comes to strings, I used two different sets. I did one legato, which means the notes were sustained and held out until the next note, and the other ones I did were pizzicato strings, which pretty much means they were plucked. So that's kind of the sound that was already being used throughout the beat, and I just wanted to keep it going with the other octaves. I also went through and added in a brass drop sound. So it's referred to in film and video as an angry boat because it's always used in trailers, and it sounds pretty much like an angry boat. So, you know, it's this very deep brass sound. As I mentioned in my previous instrumental, the real key to making good instrumentals is pulling as much out of the original as possible. So, you know, sampling, you know, I did the strings here to get that sound from the original. And then also just listening to what is being played and kind of zoning in and only listening to the kick drums when you're trying to put in the kick drums, only putting in the snare drums when you're listening to the snare drums. I added a little bit of automation to this portion because the cello hit, which is that deep sort of string sound that's left in the sample, that doesn't hit at this portion. So all I did was I added a filter. I believe it's a high pass filter, and that cuts out the low cello hit at that point. The second drop of the song does use a different hi-hat pattern. It's a little bit faster, has a couple more rolls, but besides that, it's pretty much the same. The second half of the second drop, however, it doesn't have the kick drums, the snare drums, or the hi-hats, or the bass for that matter. It's just the hits over and over again. And I think that was just kind of to slow down the beat, but to keep the energy still going. At this point, I finally came back to the legato strings at the beginning, and after listening to the rest of the beat and having to make all those pizzicato strings and stuff during the drop, I pretty much knew what notes were being played, and so I just went through, pasted those all in, hummed them a little bit, and then legatoed all of them, made them all long, and added octaves to it. And there we go. That's my process for creating NF's The Search instrumental. If you enjoyed that, leave a like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions or questions, please leave them in the comments down below. I'd love to help. Yeah, have a good one.